questions at a later time. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass House Joint Resolution 30, disapproving the President's proposal on certain sanctions on the Russian Federation.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 30, Joint Resolution disapproving the President's proposal to take an action relating to the application of certain sanctions with respect to the Russian Federation.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.J. Res. 30, disapproving the President's proposal on certain sanctions on the Russian Federation under consideration.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's regrettable that we're in this situation. It's the result of the Trump administration again trying to make an end run around Congress on an issue as important as Russia sanctions. On December 19th of last year, the Treasury Department notified Congress of its intention to relax sanctions against 3 corporations tied to Oleg Deripaska, a Russian oligarch and close associate of Vladimir Putin. The Trump administration may have a perfectly legitimate reason for easing those sanctions, but the reason we're on the floor today is that we just don't know. And under the law, we have very little time left to get the answers we need. The sanctions we're dealing with today were proposed under CAATSA, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, the bill we passed a year and a half ago among other things, slap sanctions on Vladimir Putin's cronies. The law is written so that Congress would be able to step in if we thought any administration could be making a mistake in waiving or easing sanctions. The Republican majority at the time wrote strict and complex provisions for exercising that oversight, allowing only 30 days to pass a measure that could reverse such a decision. Again, the Trump administration announced its plans to ease these sanctions on December 19th, 30 days ago, in the middle of the holidays, just before the President shut the government down. At the end of the last Congress and before committees in this Congress have had a chance to organize and look into this very serious issue. This timing leads me to believe that the administration was trying to jam this decision through so Congress would not be able to act. We asked the administration to explain this decision. Their answers were frankly inadequate. We asked the administration to pump the brakes on easing these sanctions so we could review the decision further. They simply wouldn't. So with that 30-day window closing, we're now forced to bring this measure to the floor to try to block the decision. It's too bad, really. I'd rather the administration respected Congress enough to allow us the time to address our concerns. And again, the rules for this were put into effect by the Republican majority in the last Congress, and they're good rules. I'd rather they hadn't dropped this announcement when they did, that's the White House, so that our committees could hold hearings and do our work the way we want to. But with the threat that Russia poses to the United States, to our friends and allies, to democracy around the world, Congress cannot just look the other way when the administration rushes a decision like this. There are too many open questions about whether Deripaska will still control the companies that these sanctions address. So we need to move this resolution of disapproval before the clock runs out. And I ask all members on both sides of the aisle to support it today. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Texas is recognized. Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this resolution. I've long maintained that provocations by Vladimir Putin and his cronies require a decisive and forceful response by the United States. As a former chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, I led the effort to strengthen our cyber defenses so that Russia cannot attack our political institutions and undermine our democracy. I've seen the classified reports, and I know the threats. I take a backseat to no one in confronting Russia's malicious activities. The whole world has seen Russia's aggression in Ukraine and its support for Assad's brutality in Syria. Bottom line, Putin's Russia is an adversary and must be treated as one. An effective foreign policy needs to use all economic and diplomatic tools to confront belligerent behavior by a foreign power. Those who threaten America and our allies need to understand that they will pay a heavy price so long as those threats persist. As someone who believes that partisanship should stop at the water's edge, as the chairman often says at our foreign affairs briefings, I don't believe that this issue should divide our two parties. In fact, it should unite us. But this also means that Congress must guard against playing partisan politics with sanctions. We must impose them when they are warranted, and we must allow them to be lifted when they have accomplished their goals. I think many members find Treasury's case for delisting these particular Russian companies to be arguably, to have an argument, but not very compelling. For example, some still have questions about whether moving some of the oligarch shares to a family charity and to a sanctioned Russia bank will sufficiently sever the control and enrichment that he currently enjoys, and whether we can adequately monitor that with transparency. And even though we may have a good faith disagreement about the wisdom of this particular delisting at this point in time, I do want to commend the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control. They implement and police many of the sanctions that Congress enacts, and there are good reasons for their bipartisan reputation for integrity and professionalism. But because we cannot be sure that we have removed the heavy hand of this Russian oligarch, I cannot support the delisting of these sanctioned entities at this point in time. And therefore, I support this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Thank you. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, who is a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
The gentleman is recognized. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my good friend, the distinguished chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You know, I listen to my friend from Texas, whom I admire, but he is defending the indefensible. Partisan. I rise strongly in support of the H.J. Res. 30 today, disapproving the President's unimaginable proposal to lift sanctions on 3 companies affiliated with a Russian gangster oligarch, Oleg Deripaska. Congress overwhelmingly passed the Countering America Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA, in August of 2017 to hold Putin and his cronies accountable for Russian interference in our election, Russian invasions of sovereign territories of other nations, and its other malign behavior. Under that authority, the Treasury Department, Office of Foreign Assets Control, imposed sanctions on Oleg Deripaska, a close Putin ally, and several of his companies, including United Company Rusal, N Plus Group, and JSC Eurosib and Ergo. In doing so, the Treasury Department stated, the Trump Treasury Department stated, Deripaska has said he does not separate himself from the Russian state. Deripaska has been investigated for money laundering and has been accused of threatening the lives of business rivals, illegally wiretapping a government official, extortion, organized crime, and racketeering. This is the man you want to lift sanctions on? In addition, we've recently learned that Deripaska, I will not. In addition, let me finish and then I will. In addition, we have recently learned, I thank the Speaker.
Yes.
In addition, we've recently learned that Deripaska worked closely with Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, including on a lobbying project that Manafort said would greatly benefit the Putin government. Manafort reportedly also offered to give Deripaska private briefings about the Trump presidential campaign. Does this sound like someone deserving of exemption from U.S. sanctions?
The gentleman's time has expired.
I asked my friend for 30 seconds more.
Yield the gentleman 30 seconds.
I thank
Gentleman
my
is
friend.
now 30 additional seconds.
Apparently it does to the Trump administration. which has agreed to lift sanctions on 3 of its companies in exchange for Deripaska dropping his ownership stake from 70 to 44.95. Never mind that the new chairman of Rusol's board, Jean-Pierre Thomas, has himself defended the Russian occupation, illegal occupation, condemned by the world, of Crimea, part of sovereign Ukraine. But that's exactly why Congress required in CATSA a congressional notification before sanctions could be lifted, to prevent this president from allowing his inexplicable bromance with Putin to supersede U.S. national security interests. Now's the time not to ease pressure on Putin, and I urge my colleagues to support H.J. Res. 30. I yield back.
Is the gentleman reserved?
Yes.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
I continue to reserve my time.
The gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York.
I now yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and my classmate in Congress, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I thank the chairman. 1988 was a good year. Mr. Speaker, today we vote on H.J. Resolution 30 to disapprove the President's proposal to terminate sanctions on Russian companies, including Rusal. My colleagues and I have serious concerns about many of the questions that to this date remain unanswered from the Trump administration. Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska is a sanctioned individual known as a bad actor with close ties to the Putin administration. The agreement reached between the Department of Treasury and these entities seems to allow Deripaska to maintain considerable control and influence of Russian energy holding companies. A week ago, I asked the Treasury Department to delay the lifting of these sanctions to allow for Congress to conduct meaningful oversight. My staff informs me that the Treasury Department has confirmed receipt of my letter, but to this moment, we have not received any word from Treasury on their intentions. And given an expiration date of tomorrow, unlikely that we will. As members of this Congress, our duty to the American people is to exercise the oversight that ensures that the administration's actions are indeed legitimate. We have a duty to ensure that this administration takes a firm stand on bad behavior by the Russian government. Getting to, I think, some of the more important elements of this consideration could be taken care of with just a few months of delay while we exercised our constitutional responsibilities. The Russian government has time and again prevented us from doing what I've just described. We intend here to proceed, even in the aftermath of this decision today and what the Senate did yesterday, to considerably take a look at this act that we believe today violates the intention of our congressional responsibilities. The malicious cyber interference that is attempted to subvert Western democracies, including ours, needs to be fully examined. And with that, I urge my colleagues to vote for this resolution.
The gentleman from New York.
I continue to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
Continue to reserve.
The gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York.
Thank you. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, the chairman of the important committee, Mr. Schiff.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in support of the resolution which disapproves the removal of sanctions against 3 companies owned by the Russian oligarch and Putin crony Oleg Deripaska. Mr. Deripaska's complicity in Putin's efforts to undermine our democracy and those of our allies is well known, and this is without the benefit of what the special counsel has investigated and thus far uncovered. Simply put, the Treasury Department has not provided Congress with convincing evidence that the deal reached with Mr. Deripaska truly ends his control over the companies. And the Treasury Department has not provided Congress with convincing evidence that Mr. Deripaska will not, in fact, benefit financially from the divestiture of these businesses. These sanctions were imposed last year on Mr. Deripaska and these companies over Mr. Deripaska's malign efforts, the Kremlin's malign efforts to interfere in our democracy, as well as the efforts to invade Russia's neighbor and the continuing destabilization of Ukraine. And the simple reality is, having imposed these sanctions as a deterrent Nothing has changed in the Kremlin's behavior to warrant the relaxation of these sanctions. Sanctions are imposed for a reason. The reason these were imposed was because of the malevolent actions of Mr. Deripaska and the Kremlin. They're intended to influence the Kremlin's behavior. And so what has changed that merits now the relaxation of these sanctions? And the answer is nothing. The Russian actions in the last election continued through the manipulation of social media to meddle in our democratic affairs. Violence along the line of contact between Russia and Ukraine continues, and within Ukraine continues. Nothing has changed in the Kremlin behavior. Nothing has changed to warrant Treasury lifting these sanctions. And so I join my colleagues on a bipartisan. May I have 30 additional seconds?
Yield the gentleman 30 seconds.
Gentleman is allowed 30 additional seconds.
And so I join my colleagues on a bipartisan basis, and I thank my colleague from Texas for his support to disapprove of this relaxation of sanctions on Russia and Mr. Deripaska, and to urge the rest of the Congress to join us. I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
Continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York.
I now yield the 2 minutes to the chairwoman of the Financial Services Committee, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker and members. You've heard all of the facts about what is happening in the Treasury Department. I do not understand for the life of me why there's any elected official who would support delisting these companies and Deripaska. We are dealing with the enemy. We're in an investigation. Deripaska is a criminal. He's closely aligned with Putin. We know everything about him, and we know that he would benefit from this delisting. He would retain 45% of the shares or the ownership in these companies. Of course, he will use that to basically pay off the debts to the bank that he owes. I don't know why we have Republicans who don't understand this. Where are they? Why are they not down here defending what they're going to do with their vote? Why are they not down here explaining why somehow they're not putting this democracy first? This is not the first sanction that they're going to try and delist. Oh, they're coming with another in a few days, and it has to do with Jamaica, and I know all about that. And they're going to keep coming. We should be implementing sanctions. This is about the invasion and the attack on Crimea. This is about all of the other atrocities that have occurred and been implemented by Putin and the oligarchs of Russia. And we need to stand up and we need to say that, yes, we're going to have sanctions. They're going to be implemented. We're going to make sure that we don't align ourselves with the people who are undermining this democracy. They have hacked into our DNC. They've hacked into our state electoral systems. And here we have people who are willing to say that's okay, that's all right. Let them continue to do what they do. The Republicans who did not vote on the Senate side need to be called out. This is serious business, and I want the Republicans to face up to it. Don't hide. Come on down here and defend your
Gentlelady's
position.
time has expired.
I give back the balance of my.
Thank you. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time we have left?
The gentleman has 8 minutes remaining, and the gentleman from Texas has 17 minutes remaining. The gentleman from New York.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I just want to be clear, as the Republican leader of the Foreign Affairs Committee, that I support this resolution. I'm not sure if my opening statement was properly heard by the other side of the aisle, but I join my colleagues on the other side in support of this resolution in a bipartisan manner, as it should be, against our enemy, Russia, Putin, and the oligarchs. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York. Mr. Engel?
Yes, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, is recognized for
Well, I would just say to my
3 minutes.
colleague, neighbor, Mr. McCall, I hope that means that every Republican, none of whom are on the floor here with him to explain their position on this, will join us on this important vote. Because this sanctions law against Russians was enacted over President Trump's objection, and the purpose was to deter Russian aggression against us and our allies, not to yield the right-of-way. But now the administration is lifting sanctions on a thug who's linked at the hip to Vladimir Putin and who only engages in more wrongdoing. Let's not aid this one-way gift to Putin, a gift that was deliberately slipped under the Christmas tree at the Kremlin on the eve of congressional departure so we could have as little oversight as possible. Secretary Mnuchin suggested he was open to a meaningful additional time for us to review this, but he's gone radio silent. He calculated that there were enough House enablers to rubber stamp this sordid deal. We sought a classified intelligence assessment of whether sanctioned Putin buddy Oleg Deripaska would continue to control the world's largest aluminum company after these sanctions were lifted. Leaders on both the House and Senate Intelligence Committee have expressed their national security concerns about this deal. But Trump wants us to rely on tweets, not intelligence, on fantasy, not reality. If only he were as eager to reopen this government for American businesses and American citizens as he is to reopen this sanctioned Russian company. Trump provides sanction relief for a sham deal whereby this one thug transfers his shares to his personal foundation, a kind of Trump Foundation type group, his ex-wife, and a sanctioned Russian bank. Treasury refuses to identify to us any of these new so-called independent directors. But what we do know is that the chair of one of these companies is someone who's under investigation by the British Parliament and who cannot see classified information, and the chair of another one is a cheerleader for the Russian invasion and annexation of the Crimea and their war with Ukraine. All of this misconduct happening against the backdrop of a president who has increasingly become a loud megaphone for Russian propaganda, attacking our most trusted allies, turning over Syria to Putin, suggesting that our withdrawal should occur from NATO, praising the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan with a distorted history. Each day of chaos is another day when Vladimir Putin's investment in the election of Donald Trump pays him bigger dividends in driving to undermine Western democracy and our way of life. Let's send a strong message of oversight.
Gentleman's time has expired.
15 seconds.
Yield the gentleman 15 seconds.
Gentleman is allocated 15 additional seconds.
Let us send a strong bipartisan message, not just to the White House, but to the Kremlin, by rejecting this favoritism toward Putin. Let's vote today as members of the United States Congress, not the Russian Duma. And I yield back.
The gentleman from New York.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
I continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman continues to reserve. Mr. Engel.
It's now my pleasure to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I very much appreciate the advocacy of Chairwoman Waters, but this is fundamentally not a partisan issue, and I appreciate the Ranking Member making the point. This is a reputational issue, and I want everyone in the chamber to understand that this is about the reputation of the United States, about the Congress, about the Treasury, and each individual member who votes today. This is a complicated deal. I've spent hours understanding this deal, but there's a big question that every member ought to ask themselves. Is this the moment to relax sanctions on a Russian company, on a Russian oligarch? Is this the moment to sign off on a deal that allows an oligarch to hand his shares to a Russian bank, which is also sanctioned and controlled by the Russian government? At the end of this deal, if this deal goes through, Mr. Deripaska will continue to own and vote 35% of the shares of this company. You can control a company with 35% of the shares. But an additional 28% of those shares will be owned and controlled by affiliates of Mr. Deripaska. Now, Treasury says that doesn't matter because there will be somebody independently voting those shares. I've asked 3 times now, and Treasury has not told me who those people are. So what's the rush? There's no problem in the aluminum markets today. The price of aluminum today is lower than it was before this company was listed. This is reputational. The architect of this deal, Lord Barker of Battle, is a British peer who has been denied access to classified information in the Parliament, who is under investigation by the Parliament because of possible ties to the Russians. So I will just close by making this point. There is no rush. I've become an expert on this deal. Members who vote against this resolution, if Deripaska turns out to be worse than we think he is, if Lord Battle turns out to be worse than we think he is, if the Russians and Deripaska continue to control this company after this vote, you too will become an expert on this deal, and not in a good way. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Engel?
I continue to reserve.
The members should be reminded that the time remaining on each side is. The gentleman from New York has 2 1/4 minutes remaining. And Mr. McCall, you have 16 1/2 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Texas.
And I continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman continues to reserve.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to our Majority Leader, the author of this resolution, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I thank the chairman for yielding. And I thank the ranking member for his leadership as well. And I join Mr. Himes in saying this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of America and whether or not we are going to hold accountable those who would threaten and undermine the interests of the United States. I thank Mr. McCall for his principled leadership on this issue. And I thank Chairman Engel for his continuing focus on making America secure. I'm offering this resolution today because it is deeply concerning that the Treasury Department would terminate sanctions on companies owned by Oleg Deripaska. Mr. Deripaska is a Russian oligarch, meaning he's very, very wealthy. As an associate, a very close associate of President Vladimir Putin. The businesses he controls were sanctioned under the Russian sanctions legislation the Congress enacted through bipartisan action in 2017, as I have sponsored numerous bills with Mr. McCarthy when he was the majority leader to make sure that the Congress was on record and had policies which would staunch the attacks on our country, on our security by the Russians. I was deeply disappointed that the Republican Senate rejected a similar resolution yesterday. And when I say they rejected it, the majority of the members of the Senate, 57 to be exact, supported this resolution. I talked to Secretary Mnuchin yesterday and the day before. And I asked Secretary Mnuchin, given the concerns about this legislation, about this withdrawing of sanctions on Rusal, that they give us until February 28th to have hearings, to reflect upon it, have further discussions with the administration, and make a determination whether we thought this action was in the best interest of our country. Unfortunately, when the Senate failed to get the 60 votes they needed to bring cloture so that they could get to final consideration of the bill, the Treasury Department decided to go forward. It is crucial that the Congress, however, make clear that the allies of Vladimir Putin, no matter how wealthy or how powerful they are, face appropriate consequences for their actions against America's security and democratic institutions. That's what this is about. As Mr. Himes said, not a partisan vote. As a matter of fact, in my view, if Barack Obama were President of the United States today, this resolution would receive unanimous support from my Republican colleagues and overwhelming, if not unanimous, support from my Democratic colleagues. Now, I understand the Treasury Department's goal in this instance. It is trying to remove Mr. Deripaska from control of these companies. That is a good objective. I am also sensitive to the economic concerns of our European partners who are dependent on aluminum manufactured by Rusal, which is the Russian aluminum company, one of the largest in the world and almost maybe not a monopoly, but an overwhelming share of the aluminum market internationally. However, I do not have confidence that this specific deal accomplishes that objective. I believe many of the members of this House on both sides of the aisle share this lack of confidence. There are way too many remaining questions for Congress not to act on this resolution. For example, I'm not convinced that Mr. Deripaska would fully relinquish his control of Rusal under this deal. As a matter of fact, I think it's doubtful that he will do so, or that the Treasury Department used its full leverage in this negotiation. I'm also concerned, Mr. Speaker, that Mr. Deripaska would receive massive financial benefit from this deal. This is supposed to be a sanction. Massive financial benefit. Nearly unprecedented for a sanctioned entity. Mr. Speaker, I hope our action today will force the Treasury Department to engage more thoroughly with Congress on explaining its actions on this deal and to seek a better one. I think their intent was an honest intent. I am doubtful that they achieved it. I therefore urge my colleagues to join me and hopefully in a bipartisan way supporting this resolution. And I call on the Senate to reconsider its position, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Majority Leader yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you. May I inquire from the gentleman from Texas if he's prepared to close?
I have no other speakers, and yes, I'm prepared.
Then I reserve.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was in the October 2016 classified briefings on the interference by the Russians in our federal elections, in our presidential elections. I condemned it at that time. I continue to condemn it. I supported sanctions then, and I support those sanctions today. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, until we've been fully satisfied by the Treasury Department, I support this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York.
Yes. In closing, Mr. Speaker, let me first say to Mr. McCall that I'm very happy to hear those words come out of his mouth. As you know, we've had a tradition of bipartisanship on the Foreign Affairs Committee with Chairman Royce and myself, and now with me as Chairman and Mr. McCall. So I want to thank the gentleman from Texas for speaking out forcefully and saying the right thing. That's why Congress overwhelmingly passed sanctions on Russia in 2017, because members of both parties understand the threat that Russia and Putin pose. From the illegal annexation of Crimea to the war in eastern Ukraine to the support of Assad to the attack on our own democracy in 2016, Russia is clearly a major adversary that needs to be dealt with strongly. So when we see the administration, and I would say this about any administration, Democrat or Republican, when the administration appears to go easy on one of Putin's closest pals, we understandably have serious questions. We need to see the whole picture, and right now we're not. Congress cannot be left out of decisions this important. That's something I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle understand, and I hope we can send the administration a strong bipartisan message to that effect. This resolution represents Congress doing our job, exerting oversight, using checks and balances provided in the Constitution. I'm pleased to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All debate having concluded, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass House Joint Resolution 30. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
On that, I ask for a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman request the yeas and nays?
Yes, sir.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.